Great pleasure to be with everyone this evening, albeit in this rather strange online form. A number of familiar faces and old friends out there, and some of my students who we've been teaching using another version of this Teams for 2.5 weeks now. So I can only think that they have developed some sort of Stockholm syndrome, which is why they want to see me in the evening, but we shall persevere. Obviously, if I'd been over in Belfast, I would have had the expansive hospitality of the Western Front Association. So I've foregone that this evening, but not to have to race from class to get through the airport to get over to Belfast makes up for it. Good. So my topic for this evening then is recruiting in Ulster for the British Army between 1903 and 1918. I've started in 1903 because that's when we get back to sort of normal peacetime recruiting. You have the furore of 1899 to 1902 when you have the South African War and the recruiting system is unsettled by that. It then starts to return to normal in 1903. And I think it's worth teasing out some of the earlier aspects of the recruiting experience in Ulster, because I think a number of these then continue on into the war. So it's useful to get some sort of sense of that. I'm going to try now to share a PowerPoint with you. Hopefully this will work, and it will give me something to talk to and use something better to look at than me sitting in front of a pile of books. Now, if we start there, and from the beginning, that should do it. Great. Hopefully you can all see that clearly. The slide that I start with is one from the Henry McLaughlin papers in PRONI. Henry McLaughlin was the head of the Central Council for the Organisation of Recruiting in Ireland. So it's an all-Ireland body, and built up quite extensive scrapbooks of photographs to do with recruiting and a lot of useful correspondence. Some of you might identify where this is and who's in it, who's important. It's at Caledon House in Tyrone, and in the very middle of the photograph behind the drum, you have the then captain, the Honourable Harold Alexander, who's with the recruiting party in spring 1915 from the Irish Guards. He later, of course, becomes famous as one of the Ulster Field Marshals of the Second World War, particularly in command in Italy. If we think about recruitment in Ulster, so I should just flash that up to, £85 from all good bookshops and direct from Liverpool University Press. It's obviously only the Ulster aspect I'll be talking about tonight, so that there's still a sense for you to ask Santa to bring you a copy of this. And as I always say to my students, unlike a fine bottle of malt whiskey, it is the gift that keeps on giving. So just bear that in mind. But if we start off, I thought that some of the myths of the First World War are probably worth thinking about in this context. And we see a number of these around various places in Northern Ireland, this one from the Lower Newtonards Road in Belfast, where we get very much a sort of remembered aspect of the Great War as the Ulster Division, and a sense there that this is Ulster's contribution to the Great War. We could also say that the action of the Northern Ireland government in building what is Northern Ireland's official war memorial at Thiepval on the Somme, unveiled in November 1921, so coming up to its own centenary next year, that then also ties in the idea that the sacrifice of Ulster was exclusively to do with the Ulster Division and the Somme. That's not necessarily to knock what the Northern Ireland government did. It's a fine structure, well looked after by the Somme Association, and in many ways a very suitable setting, but it does suggest that Ulster's involvement in the war is very much to do with the Ulster Division and very little else. What we can say is that while Ulster Protestants were disproportionately likely to enlist, other groups were very well represented. The split between Ulster recruitment and that in the rest of Ireland is somewhere about 50-50. And if we're thinking about sort of participation groups, the largest one is probably from the Anglo-Irish officer class, of which Harold Alexander's one. We get families there where you get enormous numbers of male members of the family that serve. I think it's 26 of the Brookes from Brookborough that serve in the First World War, for example. So there are these sort of established military families where it's a very high percentage of their adult males that serve in the army. Once you get beyond that, there's an argument that the next biggest group are Catholics from West Belfast that mobilised through the Irish National Volunteers in Belfast, that they join up in not necessarily large numbers, but 1,200, it's large given how small the regiment is, and that then is a highest participation rate. We're then looking at Ulster Volunteer Force units in Belfast. So that gives you some thoughts about different participation rates and something about where Ulster fits in. We should say that the sources are a little problematic on this topic, and I'll come to this throughout the talk. The official paperwork is patchy, not thankfully as patchy as for the Second World War. We're trying to untangle things as many ways even more complicated. But any of you that have tried to research your family trees and looked through what survives in ancestry will know that a large number of the service records of the First World War either didn't survive at all or are in what's called the Burn series after the Luftwaffe raid on the Orange Street repository in London in 1940. It's thought that about 40% of soldiers' files of the First World War were destroyed in that. And from some of the work I've done, it's not as comprehensive as it might be, but it looks as if the Royal Irish Rifles in particular lost a very high percentage of their papers, whatever way things were arranged. And the repository, certain regiments had their records more burned out than others. And it seems that the Rifles were one of them. So how do you get round that? To some degree, you can't. And I suppose that's something to be quite honest about. Some of the figures that we're working with, looking at recruitment, are very much guesstimates. Some of them put together by police officers, some of them put together by Dublin Castle officials, some of them put together by the army itself. So that's a major issue. Otherwise, newspapers provide a very important source, and I'm sure a number of you have looked at Richard Grayson's works, Belfast Boys, that looks at recruitment West Belfast, and his book in Dublin on the Great War. And he's written about this idea of history from the street. So if you don't have the official records, the newspapers get you a very long way. There are newspaper obituaries in the opening. So 2 years the war starts to peter out towards the end of the Somme, but up to that point, if men are killed in action in their opening campaigns, Gallipoli, First, Second Ypres, and so on, and on up to the opening stages of the Battle of the Somme, there's generally pretty decent obituaries and sometimes photographs of them in the local papers. So that gets you a long way. Otherwise, there is something of an irony here in that those who were killed in action or died of disease in uniform or died in any other way serving in the army, that their records with the Commonwealth War Graves Commission are very complete. So there is something of an irony that there's better paperwork on those that were killed during the war than those who survived in many cases. And that's something that leads to some quite bizarre conversations. I mean, I did meet some people out on the Somme and was talking to them about this one time, and they said, unfortunately their grandfather had survived. And I thought, well, I don't really think that's what you mean, because if he hadn't survived, you wouldn't be here. So, we do get into rather strange arguments about this. There's another issue to think about here, which is how the army treats recruitment and who's deemed to be from Ulster or from Ireland or from anything else. And the army view was that somebody was from where they enlisted. So that creates enormous complications. So you find quite a lot of examples with men from places like Carrickfergus, Bangor, Newtownards going up and enlisting in Belfast, where they count as Belfast recruits. You can get men from Ireland who go over to England to find work and then decide to enlist. Something doesn't work out in the work front, or they decide it's their duty to enlist. So they then count as English recruits. So this complicates things quite a bit as well. There's also the point that this evening I'm really talking about army recruitment. That's because the naval recruitment for Ireland isn't broken down in a way that allows you to do anything much with it. The Navy handles most of its recruitment, in fact, most of its sort of structure in Ireland, through what's now Cove, then Queenstown in County Cork. So some of the paperwork sort of suggests there's lots and lots of men joining from Cork, but they're actually men that are recruits for the Navy from throughout the island, and indeed naval reservists report for duty in Queenstown. So that complicates things a bit there as well. Two forces that I'll say a bit about more later on. The Royal Air Force, established as an independent force in April 1918, has an important recruiting footprint in Ulster towards the end of the war, so I'll talk a bit about that. And there is a female element of the British Army, Queen Mary's Army Auxiliary Corps, formed in 1917, which is carrying out recruiting tours in Ireland, again, very much towards the end of the war. The numbers involved are fairly tiny for that, perhaps 400, but still an important element in terms of the quest for additional personnel for the army towards the end of the war. If we think a bit about the pre-war recruiting patterns then, I'll just move this slide if I can. There we are. I don't know if it comes out as clearly as it might, but this gives you an idea of how the British Army tried to handle its recruitment in the period between 1881 and, for the Irish case, up to 1921 for most of the UK up until the late 1950s. And this is the idea of local regiments with local recruiting areas. So thinking about where most of my audience is tonight, I think you've got Antrim, Down and Louth, along with Belfast, which were all counted as the 83rd Regimental Recruiting Area, which is the Royal Irish Rifles. So there's an idea of tying up local communities with the army, and that men from these areas would be likely to go into those regiments. So that's the sort of concept behind it. It breaks down quite markedly as we go through the war, but that's the idea of it. Yes, sorry, I'm having a bit of trouble. This is a new computer on top of everything else, which is causing a little bit of fun. So this gives you some of the crude stats for Irish recruitment to the regular army, and you can see the Ulster bits really in the first top of the table. And you get a sense there that Belfast recruitment is important to the British Army, but it's a lot less than the numbers coming through Dublin. And the Cork figures compare quite favourably with Belfast. You remember from the 1911 census that Belfast is by then the largest city in Ireland. So this is disproportionately large recruitment in Dublin is what's marked there. And then you can see that the Royal Irish Fusiliers, what was the 87th recruiting area for Armagh, Cavan, Monaghan, get a good number of recruits, and most of them actually go into that regiment. They identify with that. It seems to build up good local connections. A lot of this, of course, is driven by the economics of the situation. Those that were likely to go into the regular army tended to be those that were short-term or long-term unemployed and saw the army as a way out, very poorly paid job, and one which offered foreign service, which a lot of recruits didn't really like the idea of. You had to be packed off to India to sweltering heat, poor food, and diseases was not really what a lot of them wanted to do. So it's not a particularly popular thing. And as I said, it's very poorly paid. You do, however, get a fair number of sort of army families in the ranks. I've talked about this sort of officer class, but you also get these families where you get fathers and grandfathers who have been sergeants in the same regiment, and then the son has gone in and worked his way up through the ranks. So there is that sort of leavening to the army. But the thought is that most men that go in as regulars are there because they don't really have too many other options. Having said that, there is another element to this which is often forgotten, which is that men could enlist in the army as part-time soldiers. So we think today of the Army Reserve, and the equivalent of that before the First World War was the militia. which had existed since 1854, and then what becomes the Special Reserve in 1908. Men who enlist into the militia are enlisting for home service, and its recruiting pattern is quite an odd one. Men would enlist for a 4-year period, but off that they would do a 4-month permanent training period at the start, and then they would come back each year for a 3-week training period, and that would be it. So it could be called up in time of war, but otherwise it's a part-time commitment. But the nature of the part-time commitment meant that it too was aimed really at those that were going to be seasonally unemployed. Normal workers, skilled workers, and things at the shipyard couldn't clear out for 3 months or 4 months to be trained. So that again shapes things a little on that front. The militia had quite a footprint in Ulster, and the example, I suppose, again, Royal Irish Rifles, if we're thinking sort of Belfast, Antrim and Down, they had the 3rd Antrim Battalion, 4th North Down, 5th South Down, and 6th Louth Battalion. So that's quite a lot of sort of part-time soldiering that went on there. This all changes with the Haldane Army reforms of 1906-1908. What the Haldane reforms do is to replace the militia with the Special Reserve. Militiamen were only for home defence. They had to volunteer again if they were going to serve overseas, whereas those going into the Special Reserve would have to serve overseas in time of war. That's what they signed up for originally. That then creates a number of problems. The numbers that transfer are good, but they're not equivalent. And you also see the disbandment of a number of militia regiments. Most of them transfer over to the Special Reserve, but others don't, largely by the wish of the War Office. To give you an example, the 6th Royal Irish Rifles in Louth go, the 5th Royal Irish Fusiliers, in Monaghan go, and the 5th Royal Enniskillen Fusiliers based in Donegal all go. In 1908, Donegal also loses its Royal Garrison Artillery Special Reserve Regiment. Now, that's important because that then means that you have whole chunks of Ulster where there is no real military footprint. In Great Britain, the argument is that this is done by the territorial force, which bar the Ulster Training Corps, and Ian will remind me, some units of the Black Watch, doesn't have a footprint in Ireland at all. So the importance there is that the territorials are able to recruit in Great Britain in rural areas, and men can enlist in them for home service only right up until early 1916, whereas that option isn't there in Ireland. So the options for recruiting at the start of the war are very different in Ireland than they are in Great Britain. That's worth bearing in mind as well. Another unit I haven't mentioned anything much about at the minute is the North Irish Horse. It was a yeomanry regiment, part-time soldiering, where men would do a 3-week annual camp. So men who were skilled workers, small farmers, whatever else, could go into the yeomanry. They weren't expected to sign up to do sort of 3 or 4 months training, and not to start with. It's a very odd outfit, really. The North Irish Horse and South Irish Horse both mobilise a squadron which goes with the original expeditionary force. So they need to recruit from the off to make up those men who have left. I'll come to that shortly, but that gives you some option for men to join, but generally those who had their own horses knew how to ride and so on. So it's only a certain section of society that appeals to. So if we turn then to the opening weeks of the war, I've got some figures there for you to look at, which will give you an idea about recruitment from August to November 1914. But we should say that there is no rush to the colours in Ireland, just as there really isn't a rush to the colours in Great Britain. The real rush, such as it comes in September. And that in Ireland seems to be largely to do with aspects of the Home Rule Bill, that you'll be aware that Ireland in the summer of 1914 is basically an armed camp, that you've got the Ulster Volunteer Force, about 100,000 strong, that is there to resist Home Rule for Ireland. You've got the Irish National Volunteers, about 180,000 strong, that are there to support Home Rule for Ireland. So these are political militias, are very large. They're tapped by the War Office, but the process by which that's done is quite complicated. At the start of the war, a lot of men are reluctant to join up because the Home Rule issue has not been resolved in any meaningful way. Having said that, what you notice in the newspaper reports in the opening weeks of the war are stories of reservists reporting for duty and the Special Reserve being mobilised and going to its war stations. And often when reservists are reporting for duty, they're being escorted to the local railway stations by parades of Ulster Volunteers and Irish National Volunteers, often together, interestingly. So this gives some sort of optimistic police reports at the start of the war saying that, the worst has passed and all this political tension has now resolved itself because of the war. Otherwise, you see some recruitment in Ulster for the 10th Irish Division, which is the first of the Kitchener divisions to be raised in Ireland, though what seems to tap mostly is Belfast rather than other areas. The first organised campaign that we see is, as I've mentioned a bit already, the North Irish Horse. Because they had sent soldiers overseas already, they then needed to recruit. And a lot of this is done by adverts in the local press, which seem to be placed by the officers rather than by any great War Office authority. So you get these wonderful ads that say that you've got Captain Waring will be present at a number of hotels: Downshire Arms Hotel, Banbridge; Down Hunt Hotel, Downpatrick; Adair Arms Hotel, Ballymena, to interview prospective recruits. So you get an idea of the sort of class basis of this. Though if you wanted to go and meet the Duke of Abercorn, who was out on a recruiting trip for the North Irish Horse, you just had to go to the local police stations in the northwest, which doesn't sound quite as posh. But these are obviously designed to tap a certain type of recruit, and the advertisements indeed say none but good horsemen need apply. So this is a class corps which is trying to maintain that recruiting base into the war, and does try to keep it up much longer. So if I turn then to Ulster Volunteer Force recruitment, a lot of that is centred on this building, the old town hall in Belfast. I did joke with Stephen, saying that hopefully not too many of my audience tonight had been inside it, because it was a magistrates' court for a number of years. But before City Hall was built, this was where local government in Belfast was based. Immediately before the war, it had been taken over by the Ulster Volunteer Force, not by force, by rent from the city corporation, and then it's used as the main recruiting depot, effectively, for those that are recruiting through the Ulster Volunteers. Now, there's quite lengthy negotiations between Edward Carson, the Unionist leader, and the British government about the Ulster Volunteers on how they were going to be used during the war. These drag on into September. The sort of big picture is to get a settlement over Home Rule, where what is being said is that Home Rule will be put in the statute book, but won't be enacted until the end of the war, when special provision will be made for Ulster. Nobody's entirely happy with that, but it does sort of park the issue for what seems to be the war. So that's the sort of big issue they're doing. The other issue that Carson's working on is getting recognition for the idea of the Ulster Division, that there would be something that Ulster Volunteers would specifically volunteer into, and gets deals about senior officer appointments, junior officer appointments, battalion titles, and indeed the title of the division to be the 36th Ulster Division and to have the red hand as its badge. The term Ulster had not appeared in the army list before this. While those negotiations are going on in London, and frustratingly we don't have any proper accounts of those, Kitchener's papers don't survive in a particularly complete form, and neither do Carson's, so it's not clear what exactly goes on, but it does look to be fairly long drawn out and quite difficult at times. Indeed, I think I've made the suggestion that Carson might have gone ahead and formed the Ulster Division before it actually got the official okay from the War Office to try and push things at that front. Hard to tell. There's certain chaos in the War Office that meant that things weren't being approved until quite late on in any case, so it's a bit hard to work that one out. At the time that Carson's involved in that, there are then questionnaires going round members of the Ulster Volunteer Force asking them would they be prepared to serve during the war in Ulster, in the whole of the UK, or overseas. So they're trying to get a sense of the numbers there. There's some great optimism amongst Ulster Volunteer leaders at that point that they will be able to raise 2 divisions. Ultimately, it is one what becomes the 36th Ulster Division. There's some initial UVF recruitment in Tyrone, particularly around Omagh, inspired by Lord Northland and by Captain Ambrose Ricardo. So that's sort of unofficial UVF recruitment. But the official recruiting starts in early September, centred on the Old Town Hall in Belfast. It starts on the 3rd of September with a series of special regimental parades. So in Belfast, the UVF was organised around the parliamentary seats. So you had a North Belfast regiment, South Belfast, East Belfast, West Belfast. You then also had the Young Citizen Volunteers of Belfast. So each of those are given 2 days each where they're asked to enlist in the Old Town Hall. And the numbers are quite impressive then. For the week ending the 17th of September 1914, the North Belfast Regiment raises 1,212. The East Belfast Regiment also 1,212. The South Belfast Regiment 864. West Belfast Regiment 653. Young Citizen Volunteers 853. And it also looks as if 218 men enlisted into the Royal Army Medical Corps units for the Ulster Division. Now, those figures are not just impressive in Belfast, but they mean that recruitment in the whole of Ireland sort of bumps up in that period, and that actually Belfast has a very good recruiting rate compared to some much larger cities Great Britain, including Glasgow and Birmingham, for that week. There is indeed one day when Belfast is the highest recruits of anywhere in the UK, but this is all being driven by Ulster Volunteer Force recruitment. So some historians that have said that really there's a sort of British pattern that Ireland neatly fits into. The Britain's peak of recruitment comes at this time in September as well, but in Ireland and Ulster and Belfast, it's for entirely different reasons. The template for these enlistment parades then in Belfast was set by the North Belfast Regiment, which ends up, for reasons I should bore you a little bit about, as the 15th Royal Irish Rifles. It had originally been raised as the 7th, but then somebody in the War Office realised they'd already formed a 7th Royal Irish Rifles in the 16th Irish Division. So you have this bizarre situation where the senior battalion raised in the Ulster Division has one of the highest numbers in it, not the way things should have worked. So the North Belfast Regiment comes together on the 4th of September at Dunmore House on the Antrim Road. So 738 men turn out who had already agreed that they were going to enlist in the army. They were then inspected by Sir Edward Carson and by James Craig, and they then marched down into the centre of the city to the Old Town Hall and formally enlist there. The special service companies, the men drawn from that, wore khaki uniforms. Others were in civilian clothes. And the local press reported that many were army veterans with campaign medals from India, the Sudan, and South Africa. Interestingly, Carson speaks to the men before they enlist and tries to allay a lot of these fears about Home Rule. He says, "While you are away, I and those who remain behind will take care that Ulster is no invaded province. May you come back filled with honour and glory and victory, and you will have helped once more to maintain that position which your ancestors so often helped to maintain, your position in the greatest empire the world has ever seen." So Carson sort of takes head on some of these issues to do with Home Rule. We then get a series of recruiting events throughout Ulster. There's 30 of them at different towns throughout the 9-county province of Ulster, and you get a number of adverts like this in the local press. That this appears amongst a number. That's from the North Down Herald, a newspaper from Bangor it was published in, and you can get some of the ideas there. If I was a cultural historian, I'd now be talking about all these ideas about masculinity, where we've got this line about quit yourselves like men and comply with your country's demand. But it's interesting that we don't really have a great poster campaign in Ulster at this time of the war. It's this sort of series of public meetings, public addresses, and then newspaper adverts. So that gives you a flavour of that. This is the map I was going to show you. Hopefully that makes some sort of sense. The square boxes are Ulster Volunteers enlisting in the British Army, and the round circles are Irish National Volunteer numbers. There aren't that many Irish National Volunteers compared to Ulster Volunteers. You're looking at West Belfast, Enniskillen and Derry City. So that's, you're not reading something wrong if that's the only three that you're seeing there. So what sort of flavour do these have? If we're looking at what goes on in Derry City, the Londonderry Sentinel claimed that over 400 men from the City of Derry Regiment of the UVF paraded through the city on the 15th of September, along with almost 200 Ulster Volunteers from Coleraine and Limavady, who had also agreed that they were going to enlist at the same time, and over 500 UVF personnel paraded who were not going to enlist at that time. This again leads to some confusion in the newspapers. You often get these groups that are sort of parading with other men to the recruiting station, but they're not enlisting themselves. And sometimes the newspapers think that they're all going to enlist. So that sometimes causes confusion. T.F. Cook, who I think is a local councillor, speaking to the recruits, said they were there to answer the call of their king and country, and not only their native places, but the empire would recall with pride how true the sons of loyal Ulster were to the cause they had ever espoused, the cause of empire founded on justice and freedom, and of liberty for themselves and others. So that gives you some flavour of the sort of king and country empire elements that are mentioned in recruiting meetings. In Enniskillen, you get a more fractured response, and Fermanagh as a whole, rather. William Copeland Trimble, the editor of The Impartial Reporter, formed a service squadron of the 6th Enniskillen Dragoons from the UVF. There's criticism of him by the Fermanagh Times. It says, well, in a month he's only recruited 26 men. This isn't very impressive. So he then bites back and says that the 3 infantry battalions of the UVF and Fermanagh haven't really done very well either, and they've only raised 120 men over a month. And he goes on to say, Tyrone, Antrim and Down have put Fermanagh to shame. Even Donegal, from which nothing was expected, has put Fermanagh to shame. If we're thinking about sort of rural recruitment, we get a bit of a picture of that in a piece that Cyril Falls, who was then a second lieutenant in the 11th Royal Enniskillen Fusiliers, wrote. He later goes on to become a captain on the staff of the Ulster Division, and later than that, Professor Chichili Chair of Military History at the University of Oxford. So a man who's well-known in military history circles, and writes the history of the 36th Ulster Division, published in 1922, which I think still stands up as one of the best of the regimental histories. So he gives a flavour of how he tackled recruitment, saying, night after night in the past few weeks, in tiny Orange Hall, in schoolhouse, even by the roadside at night, when the speaker could not see the faces of his auditors and had to read his notes by the light of a bicycle lamp, I have heard made and made myself this plea. We are not asking you to support the government that would have shot you down a few months ago. We detest it as much as you. We all have our account to settle with it later on. Now we ask you to fight for bigger things than the Union or the Orange Association or your farms and homes, for your king and country. We are fighting for our own particular form of civilization, and if that is overthrown, none of these things will matter a straw. The UVF must come forward in big numbers now, or shut up shop. So an idea that the Home Rule settlement wasn't really what Unionists wanted, but there had to be a sort of empire first strategy. This is something that Carson talks about as well. I could say more about some of these localized recruiting events, but I'll press on. If we're thinking about the sort of themes that come through, you've got a sense of some of those already. I think Ulster, King, Country, Empire, they're being talked about. Carson comes to this idea of empire in one of the earliest recruiting meetings up in Coleraine on the 5th of September, when he says, if the United Kingdom goes down, we go down with it. If the empire goes down, we go down with it. Men, I tell you, every inch of that empire is today threatened, and it lies now with the action we are to take, whether all that empire beyond the seas is to pass away from us, and we are to be reduced to the two small islands that constitute the United Kingdom. So I think my argument is that Carson basically pushes an empire first policy, which means that the UVF effectively disintegrates as a foreign military force. Other themes that are used here are less obvious, but important to contemporaries. Historians have long identified Irish Catholic sympathy with Belgium, and you see this in recruiting posters, poor little Catholic Belgium, but that's actually a theme for Unionists as well. Carson, speaking in Ballymena, says, you get an example, I think a very good example for Ulster in Little Belgium. We owe something to Belgium for asserting the rights and independence and freedom of small communities. God bless them, I say. So that's one element. Another one that comes up is to do with the Kerr incident. This from March 1914, when it was clear that a number of British Army officers were sympathetic to the Ulster Volunteers and were not prepared to overpower and disarm them, is, I suppose, the simple version of the Kerr incident. There's a lot more to it than that, but that will suffice for today, I hope. What you get about that is the Countess of Roden, an unusual figure on a recruiting platform as a woman. There aren't too many examples of that. But she speaks to the UVF company in Bransford, County Down, and says they must remember that it was the soldiers who saved Ulster. They risked everything because they believed that Ulster was not being fairly treated. Now a chance had come of proving to those soldiers that they were right in their judgment of them, and that the men of Ulster would stand by them. Another topic that comes up quite a lot in these recruiting speeches to the UVF is the threat of conscription. William Copeland Trimble in Enniskillen is talking about the British government bringing in the Militia Ballot Act. This is something from 1793 that hadn't been used since the Napoleonic Wars, but his line was that if men enlisted then, they could go to whatever unit they wanted. If the Ballot Act came in, they would be conscripted and sent wherever the government wanted them to go. And in November 1914, James Craig MP, recruiting for the 16th Royal Irish Rifles, 2nd County Down, talks of men being forced into service if they didn't volunteer at that point. So conscription is something held up as a threat. The peak of this UVF recruitment came in September 1914, and it should be said that in rural areas, the response was patchy. I hope I've given you a flavour of that looking at Fermanagh. That's not to say that UVF recruitment as a whole wasn't impressive. It's thought about 31,000 Ulster Volunteers out of pre-war force of about 100,000 enlists, so that's a pretty high participation rate. But there were limits, and these limits were obvious quite early on in the war. Indeed, by November 1914, a number of the rural battalions were recruiting at hiring fairs in Tyrone, Fermanagh and Donegal. Hiring fairs where unskilled labourers went to seek employment. So that gives you an idea that the social base there trying to get into the army then is not that different from the pre-war situation. If I move now to talk about Irish National Volunteers and their enlistment to the British Army, if we can get this to work. It is now stalled. No. Let's try again. No. Sorry, I'm not having any luck with this. It doesn't seem to want to do anything. Bear with me for a minute, please. No. I wonder, should I stop sharing and start again and see if that does anything?
Try that, Tim.
No, it seems to have all locked. Well, we press on without it. It was inevitable that something like that was going to happen. If we turn to Irish National Volunteer recruitment, then that's not as widespread as for the Ulster Volunteers. You only see it in West Belfast, Derry City, and Enniskillen, and it seems to be very much down to localised initiatives. I should say that these are the only areas in the whole of Ireland where you see formed Irish National Volunteer recruitment. So lots of Irish National Volunteers enlist, probably about 32,000 mark out of a pre-war force of 180,000, but most as individuals. There's a split in the volunteer movement at the outbreak of the war, which sees the majority go with John Redmond, and a minority, which is then the sort of basis of what happens in Easter 1916 in Dublin, remain independent and are against the British war effort. But the majority, about 170,000, go with Redmond. But that doesn't translate into madly enthusiastic recruiting for the British Army from the Irish National Volunteers. There's also some oddity within this, in that the Irish National Volunteer recruits from West Belfast were directed into the 6th Connaught Rangers, and those recruits from Derry City were directed into the 6th Royal Irish Regiment, regiments that were far removed from Ulster at that point in terms of what was meant to be the recruiting base. So that's slightly odd and perhaps creates problems in terms of the numbers that come again. The other case that I think is interesting is what happens in Enniskillen. There, J.P. Ray brings together probably about 65, 67 recruits, something like that, from the local Irish National Volunteers. And it looks as if they do go into the 16th Irish Division. He gets a captaincy. He's not a professional soldier, he's a solicitor. And you would have thought, well, that's his star set. This is him going to be involved in recruiting activity. But the War Office decides to commission him on the general list of the army, and then packs him off to East Africa to command a company of the King's African Rifles. So it's a rather odd way to deal with a nationalist who had gained a fair number of recruits, and something that they promised to do more. If I turn back to West Belfast and to what goes on there, a lot of something's happening now. Not what I expected to happen, though, perhaps. Yeah, there we are. Joe Devlin, when he's speaking at these recruiting meetings for the Irish National Volunteers, is reasonably lukewarm about things. It's not exactly a clarion call to arms. In a speech on the 18th of November, and you'll get an idea of the time lag there. So war breaks out on 4th of August. It's mid-November until there's Irish National Volunteers recruiting. What Devlin says at this meeting is, I have asked no man to volunteer as an individual. I have applied no pressure in any shape or form to any man associated with the National Volunteers in Belfast. I have merely pointed out the duty of the young men of Ireland in relation to the present war. You'll then see the poster here where Irishmen are invited to enlist in the British Army, but it's dressed up as the Irish Brigade, so we don't actually get a mention of the British Army. We get that they will be welcomed as soldiers of the Allies and as friends of liberty, not as British soldiers, so that's interesting. And in this meeting on the 18th of November, Devlin goes on further, and this is what becomes very problematic. He says, we have seen the Home Rule Bill placed in the statute book. We have succeeded in making national self-government the law of the land. The democracy of Great Britain has stood faithfully by us to the last. Are we in these circumstances to prove false to our promises and recreant to our pledges and our solemn obligations? We stand for all practical purposes in the position of the Boers in South Africa as free and loyal citizens of the British Empire. So it looks there as if what Devlin is saying is not only that Home Rule is an established fact and that there will be a Home Rule Parliament fairly soon, but that actually Irish nationalists have managed to secure Dominion status for Ireland, which is certainly a far cry from where Home Rule had got them. So that's rather unfortunate. I think this backfires later on quite badly for the Irish Parliamentary Party. What we then see from the Irish National Volunteers is that we have the speech by Devlin on the 18th in the evening at St Mary's Hall. This is to deal with 700 men who have already agreed that they will enlist, and they then march down to the Great Northern Railway Station on the morning of the 19th of November. And that's said to be very impressive. One of the local newspapers says probably the spectacle was such as has never been witnessed in the streets of Belfast before. Headed by pipers in Gaelic costume, flourishing banners emblazoned with the red hand of the O'Neill and distinctively Irish national devices and mottos, the men marched through Belfast with their khaki-clad officers to the inspiring airs that are inseparably associated with the Irish traditions and Ireland's age-long fight for freedom. So that's very different from the situation in the summer of 1914. In Derry, the driving force appears to be Charles McManus, who was the commanding officer of the 2nd City of Derry Regiment of the Irish National Volunteers and a former British soldier, being a guardsman. So he mobilises a lot of support there, though the speeches don't have much more vim and vigour to them than some of the stuff that Devlin was saying. They were not asking any man to join against their will, but to try and ensure that those who intended joining the army should not be swamped up in various regiments, but should join in a body. So a distinctly Derry contingent of the National Volunteers would become a part of the British Army. They face objections in Derry from a number of quarters. The Derry Journal, which was a Redmondite paper, so supportive of John Redmond and Irish Party policy about the war, nevertheless prints a letter that is scathing about that policy, which suggests to me that the postbag must have looked pretty big on this. And this letter is from somebody who simply signs himself Donegal Volunteer. And he says, let it be clearly understood that the Irish National Volunteer movement was established for the sole purpose of securing and defending the rights and liberties of the people of Ireland within the shores of Ireland. It is a marvellous fact that with the exception of the poor, downtrodden, dreary Hindus, the Irish are the only unfree people of the big empire who are offering their services in the war. So an objection on that side that this was not the Irish National Volunteers were there to do. By contrast, the Reverend Dr Charles McHugh, Catholic Bishop of Derry, provided fairly qualified support. He said it was much to be regretted that action was not taken sooner to keep the Derry Nationalist Volunteers together. So criticism from another side, though the bishop splits with the Irish Party over partition in 1916, so is not seen as a sort of sound Redmondite in that sense. The limits then of this volunteer recruiting were really to be seen in early 1915, and the last huzzah of it is really the recruitment of men from the Ulster Volunteers for the Reserve Brigade of the Ulster Division. That culminates in the big parade of the Ulster Division through the centre of Belfast on the 8th of May 1915, prior to the division going initially over to England and then over to France. May 1915 saw a boost which brought in 2,700 recruits in Ulster, but after that the recruiting base fell to less than 1,000 a month. So the Ulster figure has a fill up and a peak in sort of September, October 1914, but that isn't sustained. And that really remains the case through until the midsummer of 1918. Things sort of move on a bit. You get the formation of the Central Council for Recruiting in Ireland, and they're formed in the summer of 1915 and take the view really that there are these great untapped resources of manpower that they need to connect with. Now, they think that these are farmers' sons and shop assistants. And they then seem to think that if they only get speakers up on the platform to say that these men are all cards and that they really need to enlist, that's going to somehow have them flocking to the colours. You get Tom Kettle, supposedly a greatly skilled nationalist orator, who indeed dies in action with the 9th Royal Dublin Fusiliers as an officer on the Somme. He is recruiting in Cavan and gets a public rebuke from a leading nationalist there, the chairman of the Cavan United Irish League, for alleging cardness amongst men in that area. So, this seems a particularly odd way to go. So what you were getting from the earlier period, and what indeed is the case during the war, is that recruitment in Ireland is largely driven by urban recruits. But the view of the CCORI was that there were all these rural recruits that they needed to connect with. I'll finish fairly quickly. I just wanted to say a little bit about the 1918 campaign, because really you have the CCORIs formed in the summer of 15. When that sort of fails, things go very quiet for over 2 years. Obviously, in Britain, you've had the introduction of conscription at the start of 1916, so the Irish case then sits very strangely from the rest of the UK. So the War Office originally thinks that conscription is a panacea to all its problems, and that it doesn't really have to worry too much about Ireland. That changes a lot after the conscription crisis in 1918. In April 1918, an attempt is made to bring in conscription in Ireland. And as Adrian Gregory has explored, this is really to do with British politics. The view was that they couldn't increase the recruiting ages in Great Britain if they left men in Ireland with no conscript liability whatsoever. This then sees a massive sea change, particularly in nationalism. Nationalism might have been lukewarm, but is now positively opposed to recruitment. A good example of this is Joe Devlin. As I said, in November 1914, Joe Devlin is standing on a recruiting platform in St Mary's Hall in West Belfast in front of a blue flag with a harp on it, St Patrick's flag, encouraging men to enlist in the British Army. Fast forward to April 1918, he's standing on a platform in St Mary's Hall in West Belfast in front of a tricolour, telling men not to join the British Army. That gives you an idea how much nationalism changes in West Belfast over that period. We then have a situation where no major political figure from either unionism or nationalism is involved in the 1918 recruiting campaign. After the attempt to bring in conscription fails, the government then decides to bring in a voluntary system and put a lot more resources into it, but the political leadership isn't there. Colonel John Leslie is the Ulster representative on the new Irish Recruiting Council. That's a representative of big house unionism, and perhaps not even much of that. We then get an advertising campaign, which that's some of the earlier ones. Yeah, you get an advertising campaign that takes out an awful lot of advertising space in the local press. One of the aspects is to do what you have here in the Donegal Vindicator in October 1918, which is to print a list of the recruits. I'll come to that in a moment. But we get all sorts of recruiting ads that tap into everything and anything. So you get an appeal to the historic regiments. So, the Irish regiments need Irishmen to keep them Irish. You get technical arms, things like the tank corps, engineers being pushed with the idea you would learn some skills and you wouldn't be very likely to get shot at. That was one idea. You get a big push for the RAF, and you can get a sense of that through the names that are listed here. If you look at how many of those are down for the RAF. So what men are being told there, and it is quite explicit, is that if they join the RAF, they can't be compulsorily transferred over to the army, and that they're likely to be trained in skills that will be useful in peacetime. So don't get shot and become a skilled worker seems to be quite a good recruiting line. You also get quite an interesting series of recruits for the Royal Naval Trawler Service, which again is playing this line. It's not really that dangerous, though it does actually involve tackling mines in the Irish Sea, and that you would be at home quite a bit. So these are some of the lines that are pushed. What we then get from mid-June to mid-October is reasonable amounts of recruiting. I've got the figures for the Royal Irish Rifles area, so Antrim, Down, Louth, Belfast, which will give you a flavour of it. After the British government had decided not to bring in conscription, they had set these quotas. So the idea was that if these quotas were met by voluntary enlistment, then they wouldn't bring in conscription. That was the sort of sophistry that got the British government out of a hole it had dug itself into. So the quota that was set for that regimental area, Royal Irish Rifles, was 8,500 men. By mid-October, 3,710 had been raised in the area. Of those, and this is the telling one, 2,991 from Belfast. So the recruiting reservoir for the army is still largely the big cities, despite the developments of the war economy. Particularly in Belfast, you might think of how the shipyards had developed, heavy engineering industries and textiles for the war effort. Despite all that, there's still an awful lot of manpower to be tapped there. And finally, I'll just say a little about the Queen Mary's Army Auxiliary Corps meetings. We have meetings of them held in Londonderry and Ballymoney and Bushmills and Portrush in September 1918, which seemed to raise about 450 recruits from what we can make out. But obviously this is the very end of the war, and it's not clear that they all really end up in the army at all, that they're sort of expressions of interest as much as solid recruiting. So that gives you some flavour of recruiting in Ulster over the period from 1903 to 1918, I hope. And hopefully my audience is still more or less with